Hello, welcome to another episode of Field of Screams podcast. Today we'll be talking about Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Most of the crew stayed on from Halloween 2, but to a lot of people's surprise, this is the one movie that does not include Michael Myers. John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, they decided to try to make this an anthology franchise, meaning that every other movie was going to be a different story that took place over Halloween night. What they didn't anticipate, though, is most of the people have already fallen in love with Michael Myers, so this film did face some backlash when it initially came out, though I feel like some people have came around and kind of appreciate this film now. Well, let's get started talking about this film. This film opens up with a guy named Harry Grimbridge. This guy's basically on the run from these people in this car driving around, and these people end up tracking him down. And the way that they move, they are emotionless. It reminds me of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Eventually, one of them pins him down to the ground. He gets a car loose. The car rolls back very slowly, and it squishes the guy that's on top of him. So Harry ends up getting away, and he goes to like a gas station or a shop, and they ended up taking him to the hospital. This is when the movie introduces us to our main character, Dr. Chalice. Now, Dr. Chalice is far from perfect. You could say he's a pretty bad dad with what he does in this movie. He's a womanizer. He loves alcohol. You could say he's an anti-hero. But one thing you cannot say is he is not entertaining, whether he's doing good or bad things. Dr. Chalice, of course, is played by Tom Atkins. Now, when we first meet Dr. Chalice is going into the house of his ex-wife, Linda. Linda does seem to despise Dr. Chalice, which, once you kind of get to know who the character is, you might say, who could blame her? I mean, maybe Linda is the reason why Dr. Chalice is the way he is? I don't know. But these two clearly are not good together. Dr. Chalice has brought a gift to his kids. It's masked. The kids aren't really interested in those masks because Linda already bought the mask herself. And then she even kind of makes a comment like, yeah, sorry, like I already got the gifts. And she's basically dogging Dr. Chalice. But Dr. Chalice gets a phone call from the hospital. They need a doctor there. He's been drinking. It doesn't matter. He's going in anyways. He tells her, well, hey, you're going to have to keep the kids a little bit longer. So Dr. Chalice goes to the hospital. He sees Harry Grimbridge. He gives them some sedation, but before that happens, Harry's like, we're all gonna die, like freaking out. Dr. Chalice is like, whatever, I've been drinking, time for you to go night-night. And then as he walks away, he's talking to a nurse. He slaps her butt. He's joking around how he should have married her. She's like, oh, quit teasing me. And he's like, oh, no, come on, you should have been my wife. And this is just kind of how Dr. Chalice is with every woman in this movie. While Chalice is sleeping in the hospital, one of the goonsmen enters the hospital, goes up to Harry, puts his fingers in Harry's eyes, and snaps his skull. Kills him. It's really gnarly, and it starts the film off pretty cool. And then a nurse sees this happen, screams, Chalice wakes up, Chalice chases him, the goon gets in his car, very calmly pours gasoline all over himself, and then lights the car on fire, which then explodes. So I like the beginning of the movie. It introduces us to our main character, kind of tells who he is. He's a womanizer, he loves his alcohol, and he's not afraid to chase bad guys down. We see the goons a little bit in the beginning, and then we see the goons at the very end of the beginning, snapping a guy's skull in half. It really gets you interested in what this movie has to offer, which this movie's pretty bonkers, to say the least. After the explosion at the beginning, we meet Harry's daughter, Ellie. She comes in, she identifies her father's body. Dr. Chalice is pretty confused by the whole thing. He's like, oh, I've worked here 8 years. This has never happened, which, go figure. I would hope that would be an outlier. Dr. Chalice gets really interested in this whole mystery, so he goes and talks to the coroner, Teddy, who he's had a past relationship with, of course. And he goes in there and he's like, hey, can you kind of figure out, whatever happened, like, I'm just looking for some details. And she goes, oh, we'll see what we can do. And then he starts flirting with her, and they've had a past. And but I mean, once he's done flirting with her, then he's got to go by the bar. And right before this, he like calls his wife, and he's like, listen, I can't take the kids, like, a catastrophe's just happened. But he spends all this time doing like detective work and going to the bar and getting drinks. But while he's at the bar, Ellie approaches him and says, hey, I'm trying to find out what happened to my father. Will you please help me? Which you would think she would approach a detective or a policeman or something, but instead she approaches the doctor of the hospital. And of course Chalice, because she's pretty, is like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go find out what happened. Chalice and Ellie do some snooping around, and they find out they have to go to Santa Mira, which is a little town, and it's the home to Silver Shamrock, a company that makes Halloween masks. Now this company, it has a commercial throughout this movie. It's like, and it's like, 8 more days till Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. And it sounds like little leprechauns singing it. But I guess it is a Silver Shamrock, so that would make sense. So Chalice decides he needs to put off all of his work as a doctor and not pick up his kids. And again, he has to call Linda, because Linda is like, hey, are you ever going to come see and take your kids? And Dr. Chalice calls her, and he's like, hey, listen, I got important business to do. I'm going out of town for a while, so you're going to have to keep the kids a little longer. And she's like, what are you even doing? And he's like, well, I got important doctor work. And she's like, well, what is it? Like, what details? And he goes, listen, just, it's important doctor work. That's all you need to know. And I mean, Tom Atkins is such a good actor that, like, maybe if you're just kind of watching this entertainingly, you might be like, oh, like, I kind of side with Dr. Chalice a little bit. He's trying to help this girl. Which, I mean, come on, when we see the pretty girl and all the past instances with other girls in this film, you kind of know what Dr. Chalice is trying to do. I don't know, maybe he is really worried about what happened at his hospital, but you feel like there's ulterior motives here. But anyways, if you're just kind of watching this, like, absent-mindedly, and you kind of side with Chalice a bit during this phone call, because Tom Atkins is such a good actor. But as soon as he hangs up on his ex-wife, who's like, you need to see your kids, and he's like, no, and he like hangs up the phone, like he turns and the camera pans over, and he has a 6-pack of beer, and he sprints over to Ellie's car, and they take off for Santa Mira. Which, when I said Dr. Chalice does good and bad things, I mean, this is like one of the main bad things. It's like, dude, come on. Go see your kids. You just watched someone get killed and watch someone kamikaze right in the parking lot. Like, you could get time off of work probably after witnessing that. Like, just go spend time with your kids. Your kids probably miss you. But I don't know, if you have Dr. Chalice as a dad, he's probably not a very fun dad either. So maybe they're okay with staying with Linda, who also doesn't seem very fun. So when Chalice and Ellie go to Santa Mira, I mean, this town is just suspect, at the least. There's cameras on top of buildings, literally following everywhere they're going. All of the townspeople are looking through windows and staring at them as they're driving by. It's pretty clear this is a weird town. They get to a little motel, and whenever they get out, Dr. Chalice gets out of the car, and he almost gets hit by a salesperson named Buddy. And a bike like flings out of the van and almost hits Chalice too. And Buddy and his wife are yelling at the kid. They're like, "Oh, your bike almost hit him." And I don't know. The kid gets out of the van, gets his bike, and I think he flips Chalice off. And then Chalice takes like 3 more steps, and then almost gets hit again by another salesperson who's a lady named Marge. And then finally, like, Chalice is, like, able to get into the motel, and he looks at Ellie, and he's like, "This place is a zoo!" It just made me laugh a little bit. Now, you would think with all the townspeople watching over them, the cameras following them, Chalice almost getting hit twice, and a third time with the bike, you would think they would want to get down to business, and Ellie does. She's like, "Oh, we should go look around and investigate," and, like, Dr. Chalice is like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hold on a minute. I'm tired. I can use a drink. Let's be patient with this. Let's wait. Let's wait for the night. And that's what they do. They decide to do nothing the very first night they are there. There's a very loud speaker, which is Jamie Lee Curtis, by the way. It's her voice, and it announces that the curfew now takes place. It's so-and-so o'clock. I forget what it was. But you need to be in your house because that is curfew. But that's not stopping Dr. Chalice. Dr. Chalice is like sneaking through alleyways, looking for alcohol. He finds himself a nice little bottle. On his way back, a homeless person scares him to death. But then the homeless person's like, hey, I don't have any diseases. You mind if I have a drink? And Dr. Chalice is like, well, I am a doctor, and gives him a drink. And then the homeless person kind of gives him a little detail about Silver Shamrock. He basically says that Cochran, the guy who runs it, he's basically built the town with no labor from inside the town. Like, all the people that he's brought in are from outside of the town. And basically this homeless guy, he's like, well, I'm going to end up burning that place down. And he's like, and they can even hear us. They're listening to us. But I guess that one drink of alcohol just makes him not care. But that ends up biting him in the butt later. Because he goes walking, the homeless guy in this town. And while he's walking, he runs into the goons of Silver Shamrock, which they put him on his knees, and then they yank off his head. Which the guy who yanks off his head is actually Dick Warlock, the guy who played Michael Myers, which is pretty cool. But when they yank off his head, there is a lot of blood that gushes from it. It's a pretty cool kill scene here, too. Most of the kills that take place in this film are pretty gnarly and cool. You gotta give this movie credit for that. When Chalice gets back to the motel, he gets talking to Ellie, and he's like, well, I guess I should just order another room, right? And she's like, well, no, that would be suspicious. We're supposed to be a couple. Which, by the way, Tom Atkins is 47 in this movie, and the girl who plays Ellie's 23. So, I mean, really, they could have acted like father and daughter, but whatever. So Dr. Chalice hears that, and he's like, oh, well, if I don't get another room, I guess I could sleep in my car. And Ellie's like, are you kidding me? That would be, so uncomfortable, and it would be unsafe out there. And he's like, well, where should I sleep? The floor? I mean, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. And it's this big dramatic pause, and Dr. Chalice is just staring ahead as he's saying this. And you know what Dr. Chalice wants in his head as he's saying it. And then she even says, well, what do you want, Dr. Chalice? And then they end up doing the deed. And while they're doing this, while Chalice and Ellie are doing it, it cuts to the salesperson, Marge, who had the little shamrock button that fell off a mask. She sees it on the floor because she dropped it earlier in the movie. She walks over to the button, starts playing around with it, starts poking it, and then it blasts this giant beam and hits her right in the mouth. And, this leaves a crater in her face. Again, I talk about how gnarly these kills are, but again, this one is just really gross looking. Her face has a gigantic hole where her mouth was. A bigger hole than what a mouth should be. And it's bloody, it's gory, and then bugs start crawling out. So it's really gross. Dr. Chalice and Ellie, they finish up with doing the deed, and then they get interrupted by that commercial, 2 more days till Halloween, and Chalice gets mad, turns it off. But that turns Ellie on, I guess, because then they go for round 2. But once they're done with that, they go outside, and the Shamrock goons, they're collecting Marge's body, and they're like, oh, we'll take good care of her, don't you worry. And Chalice is like, oh, I'm a doctor, let me see her. And they're like, no. We have the best care. We're taking her to the mask factory because we have all the facilities that we need. And Cochran is just very calm and reassuring. He's a people person, at least on the outside. And then they drive away with Marge's body. Eventually, Chalice and Ellie, they go to the Silver Shamrock factory trying to find answers. They run into Buddy and his family. And in comes Cochran, and basically they get invited to do a little tour. And Cochrane's like, oh, I'll give the tour myself. And Buddy's like, isn't this guy the best? He's just like really over the top. He's like a gigantic kid. They all tag along and Cochrane's giving them the old tour. He gives Buddy's son a mask, a pumpkin mask. And then he starts talking about the final process of doing the mask. And they're like, oh, what's the final process? And it's like this big mystery. But then Cochrane's like, oh, that's a company secret. And Buddy's still amazed. He's like, whoa, company secret's awesome. But, Chalice knows what's up. And so does Ellie. They're looking around. They see a gigantic door that says, like, final processing center or something. Like, it's really obvious this is where the final process happens. So they know where to go now. And Chalice is like, all right, we're good to go. So they start walking away. And Ellie sees inside a garage her father's car. And she takes off running towards it. And the goons stand in their way. And by this point, you're like, okay, if Cochrane didn't know, they now know these two are up to no good. Chalice and Ellie go back to the motel, and for some reason Chalice goes away for a second. I think he goes to use the phone, but the phones aren't working. And when he goes back to the motel, Ellie's nowhere to be seen, and all of a sudden he realizes the goons are finally after him, and there's this big chase scene. Chalice is hiding everywhere, and he gets away, but he goes to the Silver Shamrock Mask Factory to, find answers and find Ellie, to put an end to all of this. There's a bit where Chalice walks in on this old lady knitting, and he's like, where's Ellie? And she doesn't answer him. So he goes up and shakes her once, and her head rolls right off, and he realizes it's a machine. After that bit, he gets into a fight with one of the goons. He punches the goon in the stomach, and instead of blood, it's like this yellow egg yolk material. And he realizes that's a machine too, and, he kind of comes to the realization that all these goons, they're really just machines. Chalice finally gets caught by Cochrane, and Cochrane kind of goes in an evil monologue on how people have lost the true sense of Halloween, and, people are gonna pay, and Chalice kind of understands. He acts like he understands. He's like, oh, it's a sacrifice? And I really don't he's like, oh, it's the ritual of Samhain. And he says Samhain. Loomis says Samhain, but I guess the proper way is Samhain. But that's basically what it comes down to. That's his whole plot. He's gonna make these kids' heads turn to mush, which it happens to Buddy Jr. It's a pretty gross scene. Like bugs come out of his face and gigantic snakes, and that whole kill scene, which Chalice observes through a television, it is pretty gnarly, like all the kills in this movie. Chalice eventually gets free, and he runs around. He finds Ellie, who doesn't say anything. She follows him. The setup of the goons, the bad guys, they're all surrounded by TV monitors, and they're in this big circle, and there's this control panel right in the middle of them. Chalice sneaks right in the middle of all the goons, he's surrounded by all of them, and he somehow activates the code and gets away. He gets a bunch of the buttons, climbs up to the raptors, and dumps them down onto the goons, which kills most of the people in the lab. And then there's one part in the very beginning on the news station. A TV network is covering that a Stonehenge is missing, and they don't know how it went missing. Cochrane, of course, took this Stonehenge, and it is in the lab itself. And once the ritual is activated in the lab, this gigantic beam of power zaps Cochrane and turns him into this white gooey figure, and then he disappears. It really doesn't make a lot of sense, but I don't know, this movie's kind of off the walls. So since Chalice took care of him, he's taken Ellie, and he's like, we gotta get this commercial not to play on TV. But Chalice realizes Ellie hasn't talked a whole lot, and she lunges at him, and it turns out she's a robot too, and Chalice has to chop off her arm, her head, and even when he does, she still comes at him about 4 more times, till he finally dismembers her enough to where she can't move. Now there's a few theories on this. One, some people think that Ellie was a robot the entire time, working for Chalice, but part of me is like, well, why would she kill her own dad? And if she was a robot the whole time, why would she run towards her dad's car? It really doesn't make sense if she was a robot the entire time, because she acts like a human for most of the movie until he picks her up. So then it's like, oh, so they must have turned her into a robot goon. But man, I feel like that'd be such a long process for them to do in that short amount of time. But I guess they do have a gigantic Stonehenge and all these powerful buttons, and the technology is so absurd at this factory that they are indeed able to make Ellie a robot goon. Whatever you guys think, comment to this video, because I was wondering about that. I was like, no, she can't be a robot the entire time. Her and Chalice did it. Her head probably would have rolled off if she was a robot. I don't know. What do you guys think? But Chalice does end up getting to a phone, and he makes his phone call to, I guess, the president of TV, because they're in charge of multiple channels. Because he gets the commercial removed from one channel, a kid turns it to the next one. He gets it removed from the second channel, but then the kid turns it to a third channel, and he goes, no, the third channel, you gotta do it. But the commercial keeps playing, and Chalice is yelling into the phone, and it ends with basically all the kids around the world dying. So yeah, pretty tough ending there. Now overall for this movie, the first time I watched it, I hated it because it didn't have Michael Myers, and I feel like was the reaction when it first came out. But I mean now, having rewatched it, because I kind of avoided this movie like the plague because it didn't have Michael Myers. But I mean, as time goes by, and you kind of watch this movie, it's not a bad movie. It's a pretty good sci-fi movie. I mean, yeah, I like it. It's fun. Dr. Chalice is kind of a fun character. I don't know. I really don't have any complaints about it. The whole Ellie mystery, that just gets me wondering, and I don't know. I just don't think it's a bad film at all. It's fun. I can certainly say it is not the worst Halloween movie. We will get to those. But for now, this wraps up my review of Halloween 3, so go ahead and comment down below. Tell me what you think of this movie, and, if you're still around, feel free to like this video. That helps the channel out a lot. It gets it out to other people. And subscribe so you know when the next episode comes out. I'm going to be covering Halloween 4, 5, and we're just going to keep chugging along. So, again, thank you for listening, and until next time.